Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another CHASNZ webinar. These are probably becoming a regular part of many of your calendars nowadays, which is good. And the amount of people who are registering and dialing into these is growing dramatically, which we're really chuffed with in terms of trying to get good health and safety messages out there to the masses, and we try and do that by bringing in some really good international speakers, and today is no exception. Today, I have the absolute privilege of introducing to you Clive Lloyd. Now, I've written an intro here, and I've already noticed that after talking to him for 2 minutes, that the first part of my intro isn't quite correct because it says that Clive Lloyd is a respected Australian psychologist. And what I know already is that he's actually really a Welshman, disguised as an Australian psychologist. But anyway, we won't hold that against him. And moving forwards, he specializes in safety leadership and culture development. And he's got over 20 years of experience in industries such as mining, oil, gas, construction, and utilities. Is the co-owner and principal consultant at GIST Consulting. And he's the developer of their own Care Factor program, which focuses on building trust and psychological safety within organizations and between people. His thought leadership has earned him recognition as one of the top global influences on culture. And I can advocate for that. Never met Clive before, but I feel like I know him really well, having read his book a couple of times and heard him speak. And you're in for an absolute treat. Clive's work advocates from a shift to that kind of traditional compliance-driven safety practice to approaches that are rooted in care and trust and human engagement. A philosophy that's captured in his book, Next Generation Safety Leadership from Compliance to Care. And I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, to grab that book and give it a read. It's really, really good. Look, I've spoken enough. We've got limited time, so I'm just going to shut up and hand over to Clive and let him get on with it. All right, Clive, welcome along, and you can crack on.
Thank you, John.
Nearly forgot. Before I start, just to let everyone know, you can raise questions by using the Q&A function, which will either be in the top, bottom, or side of your screen, depending on how you've configured your Zoom. Just fire your questions in there. What we're going to do is we're going to wait to the end because I don't want to break Clive's stride. So he's going to talk with us for a little while, and then we'll hopefully have a bit of time for some questions at the end. Okay, Clive, you're on.
Thank you, John. Before you go, mate, can you see my slides? Are they up on your screen?
I can see them. They're looking lovely.
That is good to hear. And thanks for that wonderful intro, John. By the way, I am Australian. I just want people to know I'm here legally. But yeah, you're right. My background is Welsh. And it's great to hear a Yorkshireman say that he won't hold that against me. All right, I better kick in because we do have limited time. Thank you, John. Thank you, Susan, too, from CHASNZ for all the organisational. From our end, I really want to thank Gail Brimble, our head of program strategy, for well, she's also on the Zoom call here, standing by should there be any major challenges. She will step in with the slides and so forth. So that aside, just to set the context for this discussion, as John mentioned, I am a psychologist. My background is clinical and counselling psychology. And I think it's just worth mentioning for the context how I got into safety, which is now 20-something years ago. And that was because I specialised at the time in addictions, relationships, but also grief counselling. And so when I started my private practice, as we do, I was called on immediately through EAP providers, for example, to go to, say, a mine site or a construction site after a fatality. And it was my job to debrief, but also to do counselling with, team members, contractors who'd lost a colleague, family members who'd lost a loved one. So really challenging work and very important work. And I vividly remember driving up to mine sites and construction sites at that time. And what I was greeted with was big signs out the front, words like, safety is our highest priority, zero harm, and so forth. The old countdown clocks, the 200 days since the last LTI. I might come back to that. All well-intended stuff, I'm sure. But then from the seat that I was sitting in, doing counselling with people who'd lost a colleague or a loved one, somehow those words just became, I don't know what, platitudes, just words, essentially. And it was interesting as these same organizations who had brought me in to do this very human work, counseling, I noticed at the same time other processes had begun. Naturally, they'd be doing investigations, but language like violators, offenders, breaches of golden rules, and so forth. And look, as a psychologist, I'm hyper aware of the power of language. And for me, it was like, if it's our goal to bring these people on the journey, on the safety journey with us, frankly, language like that is not what I would be using. And so, look, it was week after week, month after month. Back then, we were losing about 200 people a year to workplace fatalities in Australia. It has come down, but so week after week, month after month, doing that sort of work. And frankly, largely through desperation, I started wondering what the organisations were doing around safety, above and beyond the nice signs out the front. And what I discovered quite quickly is very little of what they were doing was based on research, was based on evidence. Now, as a psychologist, I'm an evidence-based creature. We tend to be that way. Most of them were still doing, for example, behaviour-based safety, and again, with the best of intent. And I do concede in my book that overall, I think BBS has done some good. But generally speaking, from a psychology point of view, behaviourism that BBS is founded on kind of died in the 1950s. We moved on, but safety, it seemed, hadn't. So they were still looking at observable behaviours and rewarding or punishing them. The other thing I noticed, incidentally, was amongst the construction and mining and oil and gas companies I worked with, probably around 70 to 80% of those fatalities were actually contractors. And so that itself raised some questions in me. I noted too that often contractors were referred to as them, they, them. Even the workforce themselves used to actually refer to them as they, them. And that was another red flag too. So look, long story short, because I need to get into the content here. I put the research, the psychological research together about 14, 15 years ago into what became known as the Care Factor program. Everything we talk about in the program is evidence-based, applying evidence-based psychology to help organisations improve not just the physical safety, but the psychosocial and psychological safety too. And I'll share with you the number one finding through the research, the most consistent finding through the research is if you really want to shift the dial on safety, trust is the number one predictor. And I'll get into a bit more of that as we move through. So all I want to do in this short period of time is share with you 5 ideas, just 5 ideas that for me guide that journey from compliance to care. I don't want you thinking somehow by that I'm anti-compliance. I get that compliance is very important sometimes in some ways. It's just historically the way we've gone about gaining compliance hasn't really been based on research or evidence and has actually pushed things away. So 5 ideas. And I thought I'd start with a story. And that is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson. It is still operational. And for those of you on LinkedIn, I did publish the source article from this little story some time ago on LinkedIn. So if you're curious and want a bit more depth, it's on there somewhere. So nuclear-powered aviation, this is a high reliability organisation. And look, the story goes that on that carrier, a young seaman actually reported to the air boss that he'd lost a tool that he was using while on deck. Now, there's a dozen or so planes in the air. Immediately, the air boss halts all landings. This is a big deal, redirects the planes to land bases. And then all of a sudden, there's a crew of 100 or more people in search formation, scouring every inch of that deck, looking for the lost tool. They find it. Now, what's interesting for me, and what I wrote more about in the piece, is the following day, there is a formal deck ceremony, the purpose of which is purely to commend that young crew member who had reported the lost tool. Again, with a lost tool on deck, the engine of a plane that's landing could easily suck it up and create absolute havoc. So the idea here being that error is not to be concealed. Not ever. And that little story just points to so many aspects of what we speak about in the Care Factor program and that I want to go through today. That would be an example for me of a high reliability organisation, a level 5 culture, which we'll come to. So look, all I'm going to do here is quickly put up the ideas that we're going to go through, and I'm going to come back to each one in turn and just apply a little bit of psychology behind it. So idea number one, no surprise to anyone, intuitive, we understand this, not just in our work lives, probably our lives in general. Trust arrives on foot, but leaves on horseback. It can take a while to build, but we can lose it very, very quickly. One too many pointed fingers, or one too many commitments we made that we didn't follow through on. Number two, something I've been saying for decades now, and I brought this with me from clinical psychology, and that is behaviors are not the problem. Behaviors are expressions of the problem. And as I alluded to earlier, it struck me that in safety, historically at least, we've been obsessed by people's behaviors. And what's interesting, though, is not everybody's behaviors. We didn't seem to focus on the board's behavior or the SLT's behavior, mostly those workforce people, especially contractors, and I'll come back to that later on. Number three, I cannot lay claim to. I stole that unashamedly, either from Sidney Dekker or from Todd Conklin. Can't remember who said it first, but I really believe this. We can blame or we can learn. We actually don't get to do both. Now, what I don't mean by that is that we lose accountability. And I want to share the difference in a little while between blame and accountability. They are not the same thing. But if we instinctively leap to blame, you can pretty much give up on any concept of learning. But we do at the same time need to hold people accountable, including ourselves. Number four, we can't fix a secret. For the leaders on the call, we can influence many things. We can fix many things. We don't get to fix things that we don't hear about. Whoops, let me go the other way. And number five, there's simply a policy can't make it safe to speak up. It's interesting in Australia at the moment, with all the regulations coming in around psychosocial safety. Many don't really understand it. They've shoved it over into the general HSC area to people really who don't have the background in that area. And what we tend to do is come up with a policy. And I just want you to know that policy in and of itself won't do a thing. So I want to put some psychology behind that. So look, first up in the Care Factor program, the first question we'll ask a group of leaders is quite simply, well, why do we have incidents? Given that we've got all these policies, procedures, safety management systems, right down to engineering controls and PPE, and yet we still have incidents. Why? And often I get them to respond intuitively. Here are some of the leading responses I get. You know, people take risks. Well, yeah, we all do. People don't follow procedure. They take shortcuts. People get distracted. They don't speak up. Now, the common denominator here, of course, being them, they. And of course, in this context, who do we mean by them? Well, the general workforce and or contractors. And now, while those statements on the screen are true, by the way, they are true statements. But when we start thinking that's why we have incidents, then that's a bit of a red flag. Because what we're really saying is we have incidents because of them. That culturally and in terms of our safety performance is a bit of a red flag. Because what we then tend to do is to lead to blaming those people, say, for taking the shortcut. And then we have those moments of repeated incidents. You know, the same sort of incidents keep happening. We scratch our heads. Why don't they learn? Why do they keep doing it? Well, that's because we haven't learned. And this, for me, is where sense making comes in. In that moment, it made sense to that person to take that shortcut. What we call a local rationality. It made sense in that moment. If it made sense to that person in that moment to take a shortcut, it will make sense to other people at a later time. And again, we are doomed to keep repeating the same incidents if instead we seek to understand, we don't seek to understand the context behind these behaviors. So what I'd say is all of those above, they are to some degree influenced by our systems, by our culture and by our leadership. And if we take the time to go into sense making and find that out, we can actually learn, we can do something about that. Now, very quickly, I just want to talk about this cultural maturity model. I don't want to spend a bunch of time on this. I'm sure many of you would be familiar with the work of, say, Professor Patrick Hudson, where I originally drew this from. That model is about 20 years old. So in my book, I just updated it with some of the more current literature. But now let me just say this, the level 1, level 2 cultures, the apathetic and reactive, they tend to see all incidents essentially as the fault of the workforce. So heavily into blame. Now, where there's blame, of course, you tend to get punishment. Where there's punishment, you tend to get fear. Where there's high levels of fear, we know there are very low levels of trust. So people keep secrets from management. We cannot become a learning organization. The other thing I'd like you to note this early stage is those organizations tend to have way more than their fair share of serious injuries, including fatalities. Conversely, level 4, level 5, the proactive, the integrated, that us versus them has largely disappeared, replaced by we. And why that's able to happen is that fear has dissipated largely, replaced by trust, or to use maybe the cousin of trust in this context, psychological safety, meaning people feel safe to speak up, to report incidents, to admit mistakes. We now can become a learning organization. So that's all I'll say. And by the way, level 4, level 5 have way less than their fair share of serious injuries, including fatalities. I would say level 5 tends to be almost the exclusive domain of those high reliability organizations, such as the example I just gave. Let me give you a couple of case studies here. We've already spoken about the USS Carl Vinson. Nuclear powered aircraft carrier, almost by default, it's high reliability. That tends to sit up level 5. Let me just briefly share another case study with you here. And this is a mine site that I worked with in Queensland. Global mining organization, I won't name them. So we worked there about 7 years ago. We rolled the Care Factor program out right from the board, right down through their contractors. Worked really well. They got a nice little bounce in their cultural maturity and safety performance. Everyone's happy, not least of all me and us. So then I got a phone call from them a year later because sadly they'd sold the mine, and they sold the mine to a private equity company who kind of then masquerade, I guess, as a mining company. Their first act was to fire their entire workforce and to bring then most of them back as contractors. Now, in and of itself, that's not the big issue. Plenty of places do that. But yeah, last year I got a phone call from the new general manager who I'd never met. And he said, look, I was looking what you did 7 years ago, looking at our numbers. And we've just had a huge spike in injuries, a huge spike in incidents. We've done all the investigations. We can't seem to find a root cause. Now, I'm not sure if you agree with me, but to me, there's rarely, if ever, a single root cause. Anyway, the upshot was, could I go over it and have a look, see if we could make sense of this spike in injuries? And so what was interesting is the first group I went into, one of the guys remembered me from 7 years ago. He's now back as a contractor. And he said, Clive, you would remember 7 years ago, if there was a procedure that didn't quite seem to fit, or one of our people was not operating well or taking a risk, we knew we could pause, we could stop the job if we needed to, intervene. And actually, that's, again, I'm sure you would agree, that's what we want. He then added, there's no way we'd be doing that right now. And group after group gave me a similar message. And the message essentially was that, a couple of weeks ago, for example, one of their contractors had stopped the job for a genuine safety concern. A week later, not just that one guy, but the whole contracting company he worked with, gone. They're off-site. Now, think of that. Word soon gets around. And what is the word getting around? Keep your head down. Don't admit errors. Don't admit mistakes if we can get away with them. Don't even report incidents if we can get away with them. Frankly, they just broke the culture in that moment. So that's an example, I would say, of a level 1 culture. And I'll come back to that later on to talk about what I mean by that. So idea number 1, again, simply trust arrives on foot but leaves on horseback. If you've read my book, you'd know if it's anything, it's a book about trust. The Care Factor program essentially has trust at its core. We do a lot of other things. We look at human and organizational performance. We look at the principles behind that. We put the psychology behind that. We educate the workforce about weak signals, the need to pick up on them and report them. All that stuff we do, none of it makes much difference if they won't do something about it because they lack trust. So again, I'm not speaking here about trust because it's nice or desirable. It's both of those things. This is where the research points. And here's an example. This is through the ANU in Australia. one of their concluding paragraphs. This study was done across the mining industry, but we know from subsequent research, you can extrapolate the research much wider. This is right across fields, including construction. One of the concluding paragraphs, unless that mistrust of the workforce can be overcome, even the most well-intentioned and sophisticated management initiatives will be treated with cynicism and undermined. So what does that mean? Well, frankly, it's saying it doesn't really matter what you do. Even well-meant, well-intended interventions won't really gain traction where there are people who mistrust us. And I still see this on a regular basis, where there's been, a spike in incidents again. And what do reactive cultures do? Well, they react. Quick, do something. Bring in DuPont or a shiny new behavior-based safety program, which is actually an oxymoron. You can't have shiny new BBS. It kind of died in the 50s. But anyway, quick, do something. And as they wheel in that reluctant workforce to go through their 2 days of BBS, what are they thinking? Well, here we go again, hey? Management's latest attempt to fix us, because clearly we are the problem. The same researchers went on to say that without trust, workers treat almost all safety initiatives with suspicion, refuse to buy into them. Safety observation or perfunctory, in other words, I've got my tick in the box now, I'm safe. Incident reporting trivialized or ignored. So it leads us nicely into idea number 2. Behaviors are not the problem. Behaviors are expressions of the problem. And again, I brought this with me from clinical psychology, where we understand that. A behavior, say like addiction, a lot of people blame what is addiction all about? Well, the behavior. People take drugs. No, I can assure you, somebody who's addicted, say, to heroin, I could tie them to a chair, which I would never do, by the way. So literally, they cannot engage in that addictive behavior. Has the addiction gone? Well, no, of course not. In fact, I've probably made it worse by re-traumatizing. It's no different in safety. We focus on the shortcuts. For example, again, the shortcut made sense. This is where the HOP principle of context drives behavior comes into play. And I'm just going to divert momentarily to cognitive psychology. And this is really just to quickly illustrate how human beings, how their thoughts lead to behaviors and results. You're doing it right now, a frame of mind, if you will. And it's kicked off when an event comes into our life. The first thing we do, we'll put meaning on that event. Right? It means something. We'll have a thought. That thought actually sends chemicals into our systems. That's why we feel what we feel. If it's a good thought and positive thought, you've got endorphins, you've got things like, well, not adrenaline. You've actually got things like, really nice sort of serotonin-based chemicals. That's why you feel happy or relaxed. Those thoughts and feelings drive our behaviors. And I think you can see from that alone why I'm not a fan of behaviorism. All right, in behaviorism, we tend to focus on observable behaviors, then reward them or punish them. What are we missing? Well, the context. And the context is the way people think and the way they feel. What we do gets us our results. We're doing this all the time. That's how our belief systems work. Now, some of these become what we call self-fulfilling prophecies. And for example, where we literally create our reality based on our belief systems. And let me give you maybe a typical example at work. Let's say the event happened. On this occasion, the event was, I made an error. Now, in terms of that thinking process, what I know historically here, as a contractor especially, if I've made an error and I admit it, or people discover it, I'm likely to get in trouble. If I get in trouble, well, we know where that goes. So my belief here might be, my thought might be, all right, I'll hide this. I need to hide this. So the feeling is probably some moderate anxiety, but also a bit of relief in that, I can hide this. All right, so what's the behavior? Well, literally, I hide the behavior. Somehow I do what I need to do. The result is I get more evidence that actually not admitting it reduces my anxiety. I don't get in trouble. That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, that's within an individual. What if a whole work team had that frame, or a team of contractors who shared that frame? And again, to me, what is culture if it's not shared frames, shared self-fulfilling prophecies? So again, in my book, I talk about self-fulfilling prophecies in safety. We most certainly have them. And level 1 and level 2 cultures, this is the common self-fulfilling prophecy. The belief is people are the problem. In other words, they are why we have incidents. They take shortcuts. They don't follow procedures. They just, all that stuff. So what do? We tend to watch them really closely on our safety walks up where our brains are primed to look for bad stuff. And of course, when we inevitably find the bad stuff, we will tend to punish them. Over time, we create fear, and even for the good things, the motivation is now extrinsic. So again, we can blame or we can learn. This is coming up as an idea very shortly, but speaking up is inhibited, as is learning. Now, don't forget, level 1, level 2 cultures have way more than their fair share of serious injuries. And when that continues, what do we put that down to? Well, of course, that's because people are the problem. That goes around and around and becomes embedded in culture. It's still not, sadly, uncommon. I'll come to the antidote shortly, but again, idea number 3, Decker or Conklin, not sure which, but we can blame or we can learn. We don't get to do both, because as soon as we reflexively leap to blame, we tend to lose any opportunities for learning. Now, again, I do want to talk about the difference here between blame and accountability. For me, I would go along with Todd Conklin, and that is blame fixes nothing. We all do it. We probably will continue to do it. And sometimes we might feel very justified in doing that. That's okay. Just know it won't fix anything. Whereas I believe accountability is very important within organizations. So look, blame is about finding fault. We revile, we reproach. It's often an emotional process that discredits the blamed. And the blamed in the safety context are often the very people that had the incident, and very often contractors, scapegoats. Whose fault is this? Why did they do this? Why do they keep doing this? These are what we call in our Care Factor program, parent-child interactions. And I'm sure many of you in your careers amongst the workforce, they often view safety people, often unfairly, I think. They feel like they're treated like children. And that is almost inevitable when you have these parent-child interactions. What they do over time, they quickly erode trust, they increase fear, and of course, they inhibit learning. Accountability is important, but it considers the context. Again, it understands that many factors may have contributed to that shortcut. Maybe historically, we've rewarded people who get the job done quickly or at all costs. Maybe we imposed a deadline. And isn't that an interesting word in the safety context? Again, so we start asking different questions. What happened? For example, these are adult to adult interactions. They enable learning and they also help us to maintain trust. Really crucial. So again, the antidote to the fear loop is the trust loop, another self-fulfilling prophecy, much more common in level 4, level 5 cultures, such as the aircraft carrier I mentioned earlier. Different belief here. And that is, this is the new view language, if you like, the people of the solution, or at least part of the solution. In other words, we understand these are the people doing that work day in and day out. They know the nuances of that work maybe much better than we do. And when we think in those terms, rather than just focused on their bad behaviors, we get out there. We engage in what I like to call humble inquiry, asking great questions of our teams. What is it you need from us to do your job safely? Tell me about that new procedure. Where is it working for us and where might we need to adapt it? Again, while I'm engaging in humble inquiry, just quietly, I'm also building trust. And of course, we're learning. When my whole team feels that level of trust, that's what we refer to as psychological safety. And in this case, high levels of it. Intrinsically, people now know, they're not guessing, it is safe to admit that mistake, to report that incident. Again, don't forget, level 4, level 5 cultures have way less than their fair share of incidents. And when that continues, of course, what do we put that down to? Well, that's because people are people. Our contractors are part of the solution. Idea number 4, we can't fix a secret. It's just a truism in life. Many of you would be aware of the concept of organizational drift, or in this case, work as imagined versus work as done. And I think in our moments of realism, we've discovered that we sort of write the policy or the procedure, we mandate that to the workforce, we then imagine that's how our teams will do that task. Now, of course, that's not always the case. In fact, I'd suggest almost always gaps emerge between how we imagine the work is done and how it actually is done. Now, we could talk for a long while about why. It's not always a bad thing, by the way. We often find quicker, expedient ways to do things. Largely, though, there's a challenge in this. And what we know is with these sort of a deviation from normal work, sometimes what high reliability organizations call that normalization of deviance, where it just becomes the new way of doing things, historically that has led to catastrophic errors, such as the Challenger space shuttle disaster and many others, for example. So again, what we need to understand is where that fear loop is prevalent. Say on my team, when do we tend to find out about this gap? And I'll tell you, it's usually after there's been an incident that they cannot hide. Now, it may be that they haven't been following procedure to the letter for 6 months, but nothing bad happened. So there is no need for them to voice it. Now something bad has happened. And of course, what that means is they weren't following procedure. So what do? Hell, we punish them for that, further entrenching the fear loop and making it much less likely that we'll hear about the gap in the future. Now, of course, even where the trust loop is the prevalent culture, gaps still emerge. They always do. It's just the nature of human beings and work. The difference being here, say in high reliability organizations, when do we find out about that gap? Well, as it emerges, because people will let us know. This procedure, it's been working brilliantly. We've just discovered when conditions are very humid, for example, it doesn't work effectively. Brilliant. Now what we can do is we can actually go back to our risk mitigation strategies and very collaboratively with the team make the changes necessary. That's a great example, by the way, of doing safety with people, as opposed to what we've done historically is doing safety to people, where we just mandate stuff, and if they don't follow it, we punish them. That is just where the fear loop comes from. So idea number 5, a policy can't make it safe to speak up. And I had an example of this recently. I was doing some coaching with a very senior leader in his office in Brisbane. And almost proudly, he said, first up, Clive, you'll notice over these 2 days that we're together, I've got an open door policy. And indeed, I did notice that. I also noticed over those 2 days, nobody walked through it. And what I'm suggesting is you can have an open door policy. It will count for nothing if people are too terrified to walk through it. Similarly, as I alluded to at the start, often now in Australia, there's a little bit of panic going on around psychosocial safety because there are now regulatory demands placed on organisations. And so one of the first instincts is to write a new policy about it, which of course many organisations will need to do that. But this is not uncommon. I've seen this a few times. We now have a policy around speaking up. In other words, it's our policy. You must speak up. And again, I can assure you that policy will do nothing. What we're talking about here is moving towards the need for people to speak up. And largely these days, we refer to this as psychological safety. Just think of this as trust at a team level. All right, psychological safety is a team construct rather than an individual construct. The leader in the field here is Professor Amy Edmondson, and on the screen now, direct quotes from her marvelous book, which was called The Fearless Organization. Thoroughly recommended reading. What does it really come down to? Where my team members, my contractors feel absolutely safe to admit a mistake, to report an incident. They know they can do that without fear of the big stick or being humiliated or ignored. And so, again, what we know from the research, and this is the big one for us in the Care Factor program, is recognizing that psychological safety is leader dependent. Some leaders are able, and perhaps even willing to create the climate where psychological safety can emerge. You can't really generate psychological safety. You can't buy it. You can't get it off a shelf. It emerges in climates of trust. Now, what we know is other leaders, sometimes within the same organization, frankly, are not able and possibly willing. And so what we explore a lot is why are some leaders able to create this and others are not? And much of that comes down to understanding what is required from leaders to be able to build trust. And again, in my book, anybody that's read it would know we talk a lot about this model. This is an evidence-based model. Before we roll out a care factor program, usually we've done upfront assessments, and we assess on these three key factors. All three are important to building trust. So probably no surprises there with integrity. Leaders will need to consistently demonstrate integrity. And for me, that infers other things like transparency, openness, doing what I said I would do. No surprises there. It's not all about people skills. For example, we know that ability or competence is another factor. In other words, leaders will need to demonstrate that they are good at what they are supposed to be good at. Now, of course, it doesn't mean we're good at everything. Nobody is. But well, I'm certainly not. But we will need to demonstrate we're good at what we're supposed to be good at. The third factor there is the care factor, what the academics originally referred to as benevolence in leadership. And all that really means, of course, is demonstrated care. So all three are important. You do need all three. For example, I might well demonstrate care to my team and, in fact, demonstrate integrity. But if I'm considered by my team to be bloody hopeless at my job, not competent, it's going to be pretty challenging to build and sustain trust. Equally, I can be incredibly skilled, very highly competent, and demonstrate integrity. But if my workers purely perceive that I simply don't care about them, again, you can, at that moment, pretty much guarantee trust is going to be pretty low. So all three are important. Why then do we focus on that care factor? In fact, we named the program after that. That's where the name comes from, that care factor there. Well, the research, again, is really clear here. Has been for decades, actually. And for those of you who do keep up with the research, I was in Berlin earlier this year, where Natalie Abodian presented her latest research, which is, once again, finding that care factor, not just the most powerful component in building trust, but also in overcoming mistrust. It's absolutely crucial to, and by the way, not just the safety performance. We know that psychological safety, for example, is the #1 predictor of high performing teams by a country mile. So this is way beyond safety. Look, we usually finish day one of the Care Factor program just with a couple of shows of hands, a couple of questions, basic questions. This is very qualitative, but we do, of course, very quantitative surveys where we measure this amongst leaders and amongst the workforce. And I'll get the group in front of me to put up their hands if they believe that generally within their organizations, leaders do care about their teams. And look, almost invariably, many hands go up. Sometimes all hands, not always, but that's often the case. Then question number 2, I'll ask the question, well, do you believe that in general, leaders here are good at demonstrating care to their teams? And often, in fact, the norm is very few hands go up, sometimes no hands go up. And again, so what does this mean? Well, I guess the good news is, generally speaking, it's not that our leaders don't care. They generally do. But when it comes to demonstrating care, it's a bit of a different ballgame. Now, why is this important? Well, if we're not demonstrating care to our teams, how would they know? How would they know? So sadly, perhaps it's not enough simply to care. We do actually have to demonstrate it. And again, we often then start looking at, well, what are examples of demonstrating care? Realistic, because please understand me, I'm not suggesting you now start running around the field hugging your workforce. In fact, you may get arrested for that. But realistically, and look, I'll share with you a quick case study here. I was working in Texas last year, United States. And at this stage, the end of day one, I had this one angry looking dude, a big Texan guy, red in the face. And he said, Clive, of course we demonstrate care to our team. We pay them. Now, again, you could argue that paying people is demonstrating care. I would suggest the workforce would not see it that way. That's transactional care, right? That's expected. However, he went on to say, we've got KPIs around this. Now, I've got to tell you, that is never music to my ears. But I said, what do you mean? He said, we've got KPIs for our safety walks. In other words, every month, all of our leaders have to do 8 safety walks. That's demonstrating care. Now, don't misunderstand me. Visible felt leadership is usually seen as a very positive thing, and indeed it can well be. Again, visible felt leadership. But the point there is visible felt. That depends then what leaders are visible doing and what the workforce feel as a result of what leaders are doing. And on this occasion, it turns out the way that they did their safety walks is 8 times a month, leaders would don the hard hat and the high vis jacket. They would get out there with a pad and a pen, and what are they looking for? Bad stuff. And they take a photograph of that one, send that one off to John maybe, and so forth. So in other words, they're looking for bad stuff. Now, visible felt leadership. If that is what leaders are visible doing, how do the workforce feel? Well, largely anxious. And by the way, it's not a surprise. They do this every month. And the thing is, none of the leaders really enjoy doing them. So what do? They leave it to the end of the month and they knock out 8 quick ones, because that satisfies the KPI. So this is pretty regular. So it's no surprise that they'll be out. In fact, many of the frontline supervisors will tell their crews, guys, they'll be out soon. Go and have a tidy up. So they're not even seeing things as they kind of are. As Denning said, where there's fear, we get bad data. So let's think about that. They're probably not seeing things as they really are. 8 times a month, they're creating a lot of fear and mistrust within their leadership, within their workforce and within contractors. That's an example of what I'd call, frankly, safety clutter, rather than genuine demonstration of care. And all I said to this guy, this angry-looking Texan guy, how about this instead? Rather than, if you still believe you need a KPI around this, and frankly, you actually don't, but let's go with that. All right, if you really believe you need a KPI, how about this? What percentage of your team members' children's names do you know? And let's say that was 40%. What would that infer that I've been doing? And to me, it infers I would have been out there with my teams talking about, God forbid, not even work or safety, but genuinely engaging with them, having everyday adult to adult conversation. Now, before you have a go at me, I know in reality that probably wouldn't work, because you get some leaders who get out there going, right, what are your kids' names? Got them. What are your kids' names? Got them. I get that would happen. But the spirit of what I'm saying remains true. You don't even have to call it a safety walk. Just get out there, engage in humble inquiry, spend a bit of time building those relationships. Now, I'm aware of the time, John, just a few concluding thoughts. You need to provide your leaders, I believe, with what they need so they are more able to create psychologically safe teams. Don't assume they know how to do it. If they came up through the ranks, for example, in mining, they learnt a very different way to lead. Don't expect they know how to do it. Again, we can blame or we can learn. As a company, as leaders, the assumptions we make about why incidents happen can cause us either to focus on our people as a problem to be solved, or at least part of the solution. Now, those assumptions will tend to drive self-fulfilling prophecies, either the fear loop or the trust loop. Again, I'm going to keep saying it, trust is key. In the Care Factor program, we have a huge range of skills that are very focused on safety-related challenges. But we know the first job for us is to help teams and leaders to overcome mistrust and build trust. One piece of advice I'd give to any leader, and that is try to do a bit less telling, a little bit more asking, a little bit more humble inquiry. Yep, visible felt leadership, generally speaking, is a great thing. Get out there, but be mindful of what you are visible doing and how people are likely to feel subsequently. Transactional care is not enough. Paying people is not enough. We actually do need to demonstrate it. And for me, I'll finish on this last point. We do very sophisticated cultural surveys. There is a bit of a shortcut you can take, and that is to look at how your organization responds after an incident. To me, that's the biggest tell in terms of cultural maturity, and to what degree we take a restorative approach. That is, first and foremost, we're checking how people are, those affected directly or indirectly by the incident. And then looking at the levels of accountability versus what I'd call a retributive approach, which is the coal mine that I mentioned, where it's straight to blame, we punish and we fire people. It's usually a big tell. It's easy to be relatively mature in our culture where everything's going well and we've got lots of work and everybody's happy. It's much more challenging to be mature in our cultures when the bad stuff happens. But that is the mark of maturity in culture for me. So, as John helpfully mentioned, if you want to dig a little bit deeper here into what I've been talking about, that book is available anywhere that you buy your online reading. Of course, if you'd like to have a chat with us about the wider Care Factor program, feel free. I do publish a lot on LinkedIn. That QR code there will take you straight to my profile. I'm one of those serial pests on LinkedIn. I do post a lot. I do believe it's helpful in the main, but I'll just leave that there for a second for those interested. Our email, or my email, is on the screen now. Please feel free to get in touch. Now, John, I'm aware of the time. I shall stop sharing and come back to you, my friend.
That's awesome, Clive. We've got plenty of time for some questions, and one that's already come in, Clive, which I think is a very interesting question, which is about that concept of care. And the question was about the fact that, people in our work environment sometimes aren't necessarily accustomed to being shown care or being cared for. I think particularly about my industry, construction, where a lot of our frontline workers come from difficult backgrounds, poor backgrounds. I do too. Often home life can be quite difficult, and so therefore there might not be a lot of that in their lives. So, how can employers best overcome that mistrust the appearance and the intentions behind that care because they're not used to seeing it? That's Jodie's question, which I've reworded terribly. So Jodie asked a better question than that. So
I'm sure you've done an admirable job there, John. It is a fantastic question. And I think, John, perhaps you and I share a similar background with regard to that. I certainly was not raised in a culture that I would, a family culture that care was, where it abounded, not at all. I will say and I write about this a lot in the book, sometimes we work in what I term perhaps unfairly in the book, in macho cultures. All I mean by that is traditionally they've been male dominated, perhaps even old school. Whereas, things like demonstrating care are seen as, just not okay. It's not what we do as men. We often refer to in the program as psychological masks. And this is probably a little bit deeper than I need to go with this question, but I think it's important to understand in the construction industry. Psychological masks are literally personas we adopt just to fit in. And I learned very quickly, John, in mining and construction, often just to fit in, to actually connect with the teams, I often had to adopt a psychological mask. And I called it the tough guy mask, if you like, just to fit in. Now, naturally, when I'm wearing that mask, the words that I speak are filtered through that mask. And they tend to be a lot of swear words, words that define me as a tough guy. Please understand that is a mask. And if we look behind the mask, almost everybody wants to feel cared about. It doesn't mean they welcome it, at least overtly. They might feel awkward or embarrassed. And that, where you've got that mask up, that is most definitely the case. You'd probably say, give it away, leave it alone, because I've got the mask on. When we have a little look behind the mask, we all want to feel cared about. But we need to be mindful and sensitive to those masks. And again, some of the ways that leaders best demonstrate care, they don't have to interfere with that. Look, 20 years of doing this, I've asked every time we do a teams level group, because we don't just work with leaders, we work at those frontline levels with contractors and workforce. We ask them, what is your evidence that you are cared about by your team leader, for example, or your manager? Now, they've given us lots of ideas over the years, but the main one, John, the one they consistently mention is a simple one, and that is, we feel heard, we feel listened to. That's it. That's literally going out there, engaging in what I termed earlier humble inquiry, but not just, asking the question and hearing it, but demonstrating that I have heard them by returning to them later. and letting them know what I've been doing with this, even if I can't give them everything they want. That's okay. But if I go back to them and let them know why that is, close that loop, if you like, just even that notion that we are heard, we are listened to, that's a big demonstration of care. And that won't interfere with that macho mask, all right? There are other ways we can demonstrate care. But again, I really take the question. It's a great question. We do need to be mindful that in the culture that we work in, often construction, and this is probably a bit of a generalization, we do need to be quite mindful of how we demonstrate care. Yeah, great question. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, that was awesome. And I think what came to light as you were answering that question was, one of the principles of human performance is about how we respond is key. And I think that really talks to that how management respond to things like learning, things like humble inquiry. And I suppose that connection between, if we're using humble inquiry to learn, then there isn't much demonstration that we've heard or learned unless we have some action that
Absolutely.
follows, like action without, I suppose, like there's no learning without action and no action without learning, I suppose, is the tagline
Yeah.
there. So I've got a couple of, well, number one, I'll just deal with somebody called Clements. Thanks for dialing in. Clements has just said that this is amazing and just wanted to pass their thanks on to you, Clive, for shining an amazing light on safety. So that's high praise indeed.
Thank
So
you very much, Clemens. You're my
that's
favorite
great.
participant.
Now, I've got two questions that ask the same thing in a slightly different way. Somebody asked how the health and safety officer can drive change with management. Daniel O'Connor, who I know, he's a mate of mine, actually. He's a good guy, is Daniel. He says, how do you coach senior leaders to demonstrate care and practice psychological safety skills?
Yeah, great question. And again, we're maybe loosely referring to as managing upwards, yeah, which can be challenging. And again, I often believe historically, to roll out a program like the Care Factor program, increasingly, the interest initially comes from safety managers, right? Safety leaders who kind of get this. They recognize from maybe working in the industry for a long, long time, this is actually what will work, bringing the workforce along on the journey. People may be a little more removed from the frontline workers and safety in general. They may not be as clear into the reasons why this is so important. So increasingly, we are called on by the SLT and by boards, actually, to actually make the case why it would be a good idea. And I genuinely believe that we do need to make the case for change. Boards, by their very nature, are conservative. They don't want to make substantial changes if there's a risk in that for them, right? And they tend to be very risk averse. And so I believe that if we're seeking management buy-in, whether that's the SLT or even up to board level, we do need to provide them with the case for change. Now, we find it relatively straightforward because we've got a huge background of research evidence that we can present to them. Again, that's the starting point. This is why it's a good idea. And hey, if you want a hand with that, feel free. I'm happy to drop on a webinar and actually make the case to your senior leadership team. But this is coaching, and we do spend a lot of time in the Care Factor program talking about coaching skills. My own belief is all leaders would do well to be trained in how to coach. And by the way, the interesting thing there is you don't have to be a subject matter expert to become a good coach. All you need to do is to become a good coach. And we actually equip people with those skills. So there's a few things in this that I probably don't have too much time to delve into. But again, coaching skills will help have those conversations. But the main thing is you need to be able to provide a case for change. Otherwise, they're going to just head you off at the pass. It's going to be too risky, too big. Everything will have to change, which is, of course, not the case. But often people, they look at maybe a new way of doing things, like a new focus on psychosocial safety. Really, people get terrified here in Australia about this move to psychosocial safety. And I try to summarize it. All it really means is don't be a prick. That's all it really means. But then, of course, there are procedures that we have to follow through. So for me, that your starting point is that you take the time to build the case for change, and then you do that in a very reasoned way, understanding that it's challenging for senior leaders because they've got their own areas of concern and they're risk averse by nature. Sorry, that was a rather protracted explanation.
I mean, a complicated question though, Clive. So it
Sure.
requires that, I think. And as an add-on, Sarah Brown asks very, similar theme really, which is how to get senior leaders, execs to understand the accountability, the punishment perspective, because she feels like her leadership, have swung too far into the punishing
Yeah.
piece, um, and issues about describing that you don't need to do that to have accountability. So what's your
Yeah.
tagline on that?
Yeah. And it is a fraught area. Again, it's relatively easy, I believe, to take the accountability approach rather than the blaming approach when things aren't too bad, right? When nothing huge has happened. And that's why I mentioned before, John, one of the hallmarks of genuinely robust, mature cultures is they hold that ground even when things aren't going well. So there's a chapter in my book, actually, this second last chapter, that actually draws upon Sidney Decker's research around the difference between a retributive culture and a restorative culture that I alluded to earlier. Get your leaders to read that, or Decker's whole book that is called Just Culture. It is not about being soft. All right. Accountability is not being soft. The interesting thing is, it's actually easier to hold people to account where psychological safety is high. Because for a start, they will let you know when something went wrong. When things are hidden, people don't need to take accountability for them, right? There's nothing to be accountable for because I hid it. And so it's actually easier. Again, we will all blame. I want to be realistic about this. We all get our buttons pushed. And look, this is a function of our energy saving brain. And we do this at home with our partners and kids too, right? If we're honest. Something bad happens, I'm tired, I'm stressed out, the button's pushed. Why did you do that? What is wrong with you? Straight to blame. It's quick, it's intuitive. And we will probably keep doing that. To paraphrase Todd Conklin, though, while we may continue to do that, don't expect it to fix anything. That's all. Trust fixes nothing, and make the case to senior leaders again. The more we go into blame, it just doesn't fix anything. Accountability is really important. And let me say, where there's been, for example, a willful violation that has put people at risk of harm, well, then accountability will often result for me. How can I put this? I would probably make that person available to industry. Right?
Yeah.
But I will say genuine, willful violations are incredibly rare in our industry. Very few people will go out of their way willfully to cause damage or harm to themselves or other people or even equipment. It is incredibly rare. Where it does occur, then there should be realistic consequences for that. But even where that is the case, we still need to learn. You know, even if it's about learning about our recruitment, for example, how come we employed that person? There's always learning to be had. So we will probably continue to blame. Just don't expect it to fix anything.
I think that's a really good summary, Clive. And I think that brings us to the end of our allotted time for this webinar, which has gone really bloody
Yeah,
fast,
it has.
which
Yeah.
is always a sign of a good thing. Just those of you that have asked questions, because we've got a few sitting in the queue, what Clive has volunteered to do is we'll send these small handful of questions to him and get the written responses posted on our webpage, along with the webinar recording and whatever materials that we've got relevant to this subject. We'll post it all on one page, so you'll be able to see the answers to your questions if you haven't had an answer live. Clive, you're awesome. Love the perspective. I think we need to talk more about it and really deal with those difficulties in terms of how do we actually engage people with taking a different perspective and maybe changing from some of those traditional ways in which we've responded, particularly to events in the past. So I think this is just a refreshing conversation and one I want to be around. I don't want to be around the other stuff. I want to be around this. So I think that's the choice that we're all trying to make. Right. Okay. Well, we'll wrap things up. Hopefully, we'll get to see each other again in the future. Clive, maybe in person next time would be lovely. I'll give you a shout if I'm in
Yeah.
Gold Coast area. Um, Thanks for dialing in, everyone. Hopefully, that's been. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've done because it's been brilliant. And thanks also for your questions because it saved me leaning on my special reserve questions there in the background in case everyone didn't have anything to say. So, in
Thank you,
respect of
everyone.
everyone's time, will disappear. So, it's a goodbye from me and a
And it's
goodbye from
goodbye
him.
from him. Thanks, John.
No worries. Take care. Bye
Thanks,
bye then.
everyone. Bye now.